All right. Give it a few more seconds. Okay, we should be good to go. Good morning, everybody. This is early on my side of the world. 6 a.m. here. Eric, I think it's what, 9 a.m. for you right now.
Yeah,
9:15.
man. I'm on the East Coast, so a
Yeah,
little bit later.
absolutely. Uh, everybody, I always say guys, but really everybody, really wanted to just I'm excited. This morning I got Eric MacDougall joining me here from the Evolved Marriage. Eric and I actually we know each other through the Dad's Edge Alliance, which is a mastermind for men and for dads. And so Larry Hagner created that community, and it's kind of brought Eric and I together, and we've sort of forged our not our own paths away from the Dad's Edge Alliance, but really just like we've created our own thing out in the world. And Eric, has gone down this path with his wife Kate with the development of Evolved Marriage, and I've really, really loved what's been created here. First of all, just the partnership between the two of you to create something like this, and I've really been just so impressed by like I mentioned in the post that I created for this, like just the fun, the energy, and the real honesty that you guys have brought to this process. It's not all like, the typical like Instagram, like everything's perfect here. It's like, no, like this is relationship. But I've really loved what you guys have created. So I wanted to bring you on today and really just I'll give people the chance to connect with you and see what you guys are up to. So that was my very long-winded intro, but thanks for being here.
Dude, thanks for having me, man. It's awesome. I'm really excited for the conversation, and I really appreciate the kind words. I think the message we try to put out there, Kate and I, is honest and it's real. We're constantly evolving and growing, and there's a lot of things in life that we don't have figured out. But as we're continuing to grow, we like to share our journey with people. Hopefully, people can kind of avoid some of the mistakes that we've made and learn from. Certainly, I don't think we
Yeah.
would be here without a lot of those mistakes and challenges that we've experienced.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if you are on live this morning, feel free to put your name in the chat. We'll make it as interactive as we can. And if you guys have any questions or topics, there will be sort of a period where we get to dive into some of that afterwards. So please feel free to bring it in. So Eric, I'd love to just hear from you what what had you guys go down this path of focusing on marriage and and just like the development of marriage as like the space that you guys wanted to like bring your gifts to?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Andrew. I think for us, it really started about 4 years ago. Kate and I, my wife and I, we've been together 18 years, and we had an amazing journey together. And when we had kids, things started to become very challenging. I was, as a father, I had a lot of limiting beliefs around how I could raise my kids, whether or not I was good enough as a father, all these things. And so I really dove into my work, right, in order to validate myself, in order to feel really great and find those successes. And my wife herself, she was raising, one, but eventually two kids at home. And she really felt like a single mother. And what we realized over time, after our kids were, probably 5 and 3, that Kate and I, we were totally disconnected. We had been avoiding our connection. We had been avoiding conflict. We have been kind of just drifting apart. And over time, not only with me being at work all the time, at one point I was working, 16, 18-hour days. I was in the hotel industry. So sometimes I would even just like stay at the hotel to wake up the next morning and work. So sometimes I would be gone 3 or 4 days at a time. And not only that, I was battling my own issues with alcoholism, which was affecting not only me, but also my marriage. And so Kate and me, I don't think we were in love anymore. There's no longer this spark, this teamwork, this, I guess attraction, but also compassion for each other.
Mm,
I think there was a lot of frustration. There was a lot of resentment. So what it led to was us getting separated. I think there was a lot of, from my end, there was a lot of emotional abuse towards my wife. Kate didn't have a lot of support herself. A lot of people were telling us to just end the marriage. And so we took some space. And what we realized was that, a lot of the issues that we were dealing with, me and Kate was dealing with were internal issues. They were struggles that I was facing within myself that really were being reflected in my relationship with Kate. And something we realized was that, regardless of whether I stayed with Kate or I didn't, these are issues, things that I would have to work on and face one day. And so we really made the choice to recommit to our marriage and work together at some of these challenges. So
Mm,
I threw myself into personal growth. I got a lot of help through different coaching, masterminds, therapy. We did a lot of therapy together, which was really, really beneficial for us. And we still do therapy. We have an amazing marriage, and we're huge, huge. We're outspoken about the therapy that we do. And I think Kate, for herself, she also did a lot of her own inner work. And what we realized through a lot of that was that at first, when we felt really lost, there was really only two sides of the marriage coin that you could find. There was, you're completely broken and you should end your marriage and it's not going to work out. And obviously you're not together. So move towards divorce. Or everything's amazing and we don't talk about issues. And here's kind of the highlight reel that we experience in life. And that was tough for Kate and I, because I think for us, there was a lot of judgment, right? There was a lot of like, well, if other people aren't facing these problems and we're kind of in the middle, which option do we choose? And I think our journey and what we did with Evolve Marriage really came from a place of like, what if we just had a different option, right? What if we
mm.
were outspoken and open about this stuff takes work and we still have conflict and it's messy, but we're deeply in love, and it's complex, right? And so I think when we started to put that message out there, a lot of people responded to it. But really, it just started, the podcast and our journey started really with just our own therapy, talking about it, right? Being open
Mhm.
about what we were facing and learning through different experts that we have on the podcast and different people who have helped us in our journey, which has been really great. Um, but I think for us, that's really where the podcast, the birth of it all started, was that we wanted to give a message that was real, that was authentic. Not to say that some of those messages aren't out there. I think they were just a little harder to find.
Mm.
But for us, we don't necessarily think, we're not pro marriage, pro divorce, we're pro health. And for us, it's really important to think about the relationship, and regardless of whether or not Kate and I were going to stay together or not, we were going to have a relationship. We had two kids together. We were going to be co-parents. So why not give this marriage a try? Why not really kind of throw ourselves out there and stop avoiding, some of these inner conflicts that we were facing, and really work together to create something amazing, which we've done and continue to do, right? Continue to evolve together.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so many like just amazing pieces in your share there. It's almost like, oh, like where am I curious about? And I guess one of the first places I'd speak to is like, okay, you know, how how were the two of you on board for this? Generally the time, like a lot of the times in the conversations that I have with folks, that it's sort of one person who is sort of like wanting to create the change, and they're kind of like dragging the other person around, like along. Um, and so, but it sounds like, even in like sort of the darkness that you guys went through, like you both were on board of creating something different. So like, I'd love to hear more around that piece of just like that pathway that was created.
Yeah, I think a lot of it came from, coaching that we had received. We got a lot of help from other people in our life. But to be honest, Andrew, and Kate and I say this all the time to other couples, really, it takes one person to change and two people to stay the same. And what we always say, the catalyst for change is always one person, right?
Mm,
It's either one person is frustrated with the situation, one person is no longer, willing to continue the marriage as it is. And so I think there was a lot of opportunities for us to change, but the other partner was never really open. So what was
mhm,
happening is, one of us would try to grow and kind of be into the change and be like, okay, I'm going to go do this. And then we were actually too emotionally fused, right? There was too much codependency, where when the other partner was unwilling to move, we were like, okay, fine, I'll stay with you then. But I think one time, especially when we created space and we had time where we were separated from each other, I really had to look myself in the mirror. And I think Kate did the same on her own terms, but it really became about, what type of husband do I want to be? What type of man do I want to be, right? If I decide to end this marriage, do I really want to look at myself in the mirror? And can I be honest with myself and say, I gave this the best I could?
mhm.
Or, if I'm really honest with myself, am I saying like, well, I'm actually just avoiding and I'm trying to end something to move away from discomfort? And so I don't know necessarily that at first it happened all at once. I think what probably happened is we both had our own journeys and our own catalysts outside of the marriage. And that only happened from creating space. And then eventually we realized like, oh, we're actually on the same trajectory, right? Regardless
Hmm.
of maybe we're not at the same exactly side by side right now, we are moving towards the same direction, which is divorce is no longer an option for us. We're committed to the marriage. And whatever that looked like for Kate and her journey, it was important for her to own that. And whatever it was for me, it was important for me to own that. So there was a time in our marriage, and still is, sometimes I'm deep into personal growth and I'm doing these big retreats and stuff like that. And Kate is slowing down a bit, or vice versa, right? Sometimes Kate is very social week to week. She's out there, she's in our community, she's connecting with other women. And for me, I'm a little more reclusive during that time. And for us, it was less about, hey, are we always side by side? And more about, hey, are we heading in the same direction? And so it was
Hmm.
important for us to really honor our own journey and create enough differentiation to say, hey, it's totally okay. You have your journey, I have mine. But as long as we're on the same course, moving towards the same ideal, the same vision, that's all that matters.
Yeah, and it's um interesting because like I can even speak for myself, but like there's something so great about what you shared there that like okay, you can have like those individual paths, and then ultimately like the goal is to sort of be like aligned in that sort of pathway that you're creating. And so like I know for myself, like one of the places that I've sort of developed into is like okay, I am very predictable in that like I can create that individual path now. I'm not worried about like I'm not enmeshed so much that like that's like this is the one and only thing in my life, right? But like how have you found, an individual like sort of like you guys both being on that individual path of development, whatever you want to call it, and also creating it so that the marriage is still like the house, the foundation. Like how do you merge both sides?
Yeah, that's a great question, Andrew. And I think, so if David Dida teaches a lot about this in terms of like the three stages of a man. And a lot of times, Dr. Glover talks about it in No More Mr. Nice Guy, this idea of codependency, emotional fusion, right? That's kind of the nice guy syndrome. And so for us, early on in our marriage, we thought it was one or the other, right? It was like,
Hmm.
how do I hold on to myself, right? How do I be an individual? How do I not lose myself to the marriage? That was one option. Or how do I get fully as one into a marriage and have a healthy marriage? And for a lot of people, they think it's one or the other. But what we realized over time is that, in order to have a healthy marriage, it needs both, right? So not only do we need to hold on to our own individuality because it's not attractive, it's not desirable to be with a person you know every single thing about, right?
Hmm.
That creates a marriage full of love, full of intimacy, but no passion, no excitement, right? Because you know everything about this person. So there's no more mystery. And what I often teach men, and Kate talks about it with women, is there's three stages. The first stage is this idea of autonomy, right? And we call it like independence, full on independence. And I think when we're single, right, before we get into a relationship, we're very comfortable with this. I kind of know who I am. I'm autonomous. It's my way or the highway. And I think a lot of nice guys, we fear that man, right? We fear because we think he's kind of a jerk. He's like, it's
Hmm.
my way or the highway. I just do what I want. Who cares about everybody else? I'm steamrolling everybody in my life. And so that's kind of the first stage. And what happens is as we evolve, we go into second stage, which is this codependency model, right? Which is the nice guy, emotional fused, which is I want to do everything for you. I want you to be happy, right? This is where happy wife, happy life comes from, where your needs are paramount, even at the sacrifice of myself. So we see a lot of men who they no longer have hobbies, they've given up themselves, they no longer have friendship circles, they no longer have any of that stuff because what matters the most is that their wife needs to be happy. And when you're codependent or emotionally fused, right, what happens is unless your wife's happy, you don't feel value as a human being.
Hmm.
You're like, well, if my wife's unhappy, that means I'm a bad husband because you're fused emotionally. And the third stage, so I would say that in order to have a healthy third stage, which is the healthiest version, you need a little bit of both of those. So it's not one or the other, it's actually one and the other. Because third stage is about focusing on the health of the relationship. And as long as you can create awareness around that, right? And always think about what is healthiest for the marriage, what is healthiest for the relationship. Sometimes that means giving Kate some space to do her own thing, to find her own journey. But sometimes that means me saying, like, hey, I'm inviting you on this date night because we spend, 6 nights a week watching TV for 2 hours before we go to bed.
Hmm.
So what's healthy for the marriage is for me to plan this date night and invite you to it so we can get out of our environment and do something different in order to reignite that passion. But that doesn't come from a place of fear. That's not, oh my God, like we're going to have this crappy marriage because we watch TV all the time. Because sometimes what's healthy for the marriage is to sit around and watch TV,
Hmm.
right? And that takes a lot of awareness for a man to not make choices from autonomy, from this like standoffish, I'm cutting you out in order for me to feel safe, or make choices from that emotionally fused, which is I'll just give you everything you want and then eventually just grow resentful and frustrated that you're not giving me what I want. It's actually the third stage, which is I need to really hold on to myself and understand what's healthiest for me, that solid self. And I need to be aware and in touch with you enough to be compassionate about your needs at the same time. Right. And as long as you do both together. So for Kate and I, it's not one or the other, it's actually one and the other.
Hmm.
So, like, practically what happened last night, this is a great example because it literally happened last night. We're planning for a big 2 months. We RV every summer. My wife's a teacher. So we're taking 2 months off. So it's kind of, financial gymnastics. We're like figuring out where the money goes. It's tax season. I have a business. So there's all these things happening. And so Kate is worried about money. She's like, hey, what's going
Hmm.
on? Like, we're gonna have to cancel this trip. So I'm trying to, talk to her. I'm like, okay, cool. We'll settle it. Let's sit down. We'll organize everything. Cool. Everything looks good. This is how much money I need to make. This is how much we need to save. And Kate was frustrated. And I'm like, oh, you seem frustrated. And she's like, yeah, like I just can't get excited about a trip we're gonna have to cancel. And I'm like, hey, Kate, like I'm not planning on canceling the trip. And she's like, oh, it's just ridiculous. We're never gonna be able to do this. And so I said, hey, do you need my support here to help you with this? And she's like, no, like this is ridiculous. I'm like, great. So I'm just gonna let you experience this anger, this frustration. You experience this. I'll be around the house. If you need me, just come and say hey, and I'm happy to help in any way I can. And I let Kate experience her anger. I let Kate experience her frustration, this idea of loss of our trip. And later on, about an hour later, she came to me and she said, thanks. Thanks for letting me experience that. I realized that we can make this happen if we want. But what used to happen, and I think what a lot of men do in those moments, is because we're uncomfortable with our wife imagining this, because we see somebody who's hurting, frustrated, suffering, we try to do something about it.
Hmm.
And then we add our crap to their crap. And now it no longer is about them facing themselves. Now it's like an argument and a conflict of like, oh, you should be excited for this trip, and this is how you should be, and this is how you should act, and which is just based in fear.
Hmm.
And so that's kind of what I realized, right? That was a perfect example of me being able to hold space for my wife and allowing her to just sit in that emotion because it's not threatening to me for my wife to have an emotional experience anymore like it used to be.
Yeah, and thanks for sharing that example. It's really just like a live in the moment example of like how this goes, and the real like authenticity around it, right? Like, yeah, this is a moment where um it probably, according to plan, whatever you want to call it, like probably, it could throw you off, if you weren't sort of in the moment with it. And so one of the things that I'm interested in for sort of the listener there is like, okay, even in how you spoke, like in the communication aspects of it, like there was the holding space, but even the questions, they felt like supportive, with that awareness. And so how does one sort of get into the process of being able to develop those types of communication skills in the moment?
Yeah, so I think tactically there's a few things you can do, but what I firmly believe is that a lot of this way that we're communicating, a lot of the actions we take in our life, they really start with how we perceive it, right? And what's happening inside. Pardon me, Andrew. So oftentimes what I teach men is that our thoughts, our mind is going to make up whatever story it wants to make up to benefit us and to keep us safe, right? At our core as human beings, we're designed to avoid pain. It's why we've survived for so long. And so what I talk about is within all of us, there's what's called a head voice and a heart voice, right? And this is the core of what I do. This is like the belief change that I coach men with. And we all have this. And what often happens is the head voice is really based in scarcity, it's based in fear, right? A lot of times people think that wolf analogy, like that's the fear wolf, right?
Hmm.
It's based in trying to control situations to prevent pain. A lot of times it's looking to the past to prevent future pain. So that's kind of fear. But then we also have a heart voice. And for some of us, we haven't tapped into our heart voice in years, right? We like live in our head voice because the reality is these voices, they perpetuate themselves.
Hmm.
But the heart voice is the voice of creation, right? It's the voice of courage, of purpose, of big picture. So when I'm thinking about the health of the marriage, that's the heart voice, right? And a lot of us haven't heard that voice in years, but in those moments, right, where Kate was in that experience, my head voice probably sounds something like, and it's there, right? It comes in, it's the first voice that comes up, and I just have to comment, but probably sounds something like, oh, I can't believe Kate's mad about this trip. I need her to be happy about this trip. If she's unhappy, we're not going to be able to hang out tonight. Maybe that means we're not going to be able to have sex later on. This is uncomfortable. Like, why are you always pissed? We're trying to make this work. That's all head voice.
Hmm.
And what happens is in that moment, if we can really start to respond instead of react, we can actually calm that voice down and say, hey, thanks. I appreciate you. But what's actually happening is the heart voice, which I can tap into at any point. And the heart voice sounds something like this, right? My wife's scared. She's worried financially, right? I have an opportunity here to really calm her, to give her space, to allow her to experience this so she can learn what it's like to be frustrated and understand that it's okay. That her being frustrated about something she's scared about or something that might not happen doesn't mean that thing won't happen,
Hmm.
right? I know
Hmm.
we're going to make this work. I know we're going to make this happen. And it's really important for my wife to have this space where she can be emotional without any judgment, because that's the type of husband I want to be. And when I tell myself that story, right, the heart voice story, typically it leads me to feel empowered, courageous, which then I take completely different actions. Because oftentimes the story we're telling ourselves about a situation will lead us to feel a certain way, which then will lead us to take certain actions. And over time, that's going to manifest our life, right? So if I'm always in fear, I'm constantly trying to control. Well, my actions are going to be very much directing and correcting my wife, trying to get rid of her emotional experience, avoiding her or withholding love when she doesn't give me what I want, right? And over time, what that's going to manifest is a disconnected relationship. And it really all starts with what's going on in your mind and how you choose to show up in the world based on those thoughts.
Yeah, it's really powerful. Just again, even as you speak to like coming from the heart, it's amazing what can happen from that place when we're connected to it. Even as you kind of pointed to, like the vision of the marriage, or just really supporting our partner in those moments and ourselves. And it's interesting because there's also, I know I can speak for myself, like some of the things that show up for me in those moments is like righteousness or ego, or like it's almost like I know what to do and then I don't do it. It's almost like I kind of stay in that like ego state. So in those moments where you find those sort of like those tendencies where like, I don't really want to do something here, how do you shift yourself back to that place of heart?
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that I think men typically do when they move to that head voice is they immediately go into judgment, right?
Mm,
And so foundationally, what I tell all men is that the head voice is part of you. So many men that when we start coaching and we start this coaching relationship, they're like, great, how do I get rid of this head voice? And it's like, you can't. It serves a purpose. It's there
mm-hmm,
to protect you, right? And it's important. But what you can do is just quiet it down and understand when it serves you and when it doesn't. But as soon as what happens typically is that men, they do something from their head voice, right? They take an action and then they spend all their time telling themselves how horrible they are, which then inevitably continues to perpetuate the head voice. So, one of the foundational things that I talk about is just radical self acceptance, right? I firmly believe, my belief is that life is 50-50,
mm-hmm,
right? 50, absolutely amazing, super awesome, gonna experience the best of life. 50, totally crap, just suffering, just garbage. And if you can truly believe that, you're gonna stop trying to make your life 90-10, right?
mm,
Because so much of our pain comes from the resistance or the avoidance of the reality of life. And so what I always tell people is like, if you're able to accept that you're gonna screw up, like this is one thing Kate and I talk about a lot, like we're gonna have conflict, we're gonna fight, it's gonna be uncomfortable, there's gonna be resentment, and we own that. So literally, Kate and I, we have these open conversations where I'm trying to do something. She's like, I don't want to be touched right now. I'm like, "You
Mhm.
okay?" She's like, I have this story in my head, and to be honest, I'm kind of resenting you right now." And I'm like, "Okay, do you want me to help you create a different story?" She's like, "I'm not ready for that right now." Okay.
Mhm.
I'm not threatened by that. It's your story. I know that I'm solid enough to be me. I'm a healthy husband. We have an amazing marriage. But this story you're telling yourself, you need to work through that. And then what'll happen is typically later on, Kate will come to me, or I'll go to her in those moments and be like, "Okay, I'm ready to create a different story. Tell me what's happening with you lately. What's been going on the past 2 weeks?" Because my story is you've been deep into work, you're avoiding me, you're, not a great wife, you're not showing up for me. And I know that's not true. So let's help each other create a different story. And so you can get help, right? You can get help from your partner, you can get help from other people just by speaking it out into the world. But I think it's really important to understand that this is part of you, the good
Mhm.
and the bad, right? So in those moments, what happens is understand that you have a choice, right? When you're thinking after that conflict, when you're sitting there and you have this righteousness, you have this ego of like, "Oh, she should have done this." Understand that you're choosing to think that right now,
Mhm.
right? And if you can understand that you have a choice to do literally whatever you want, you could actually in that moment pattern trap yourself and get up and go be super awkward and be like, "I'm still really mad at you, but I want to tell you that I love you. I'm going to continue working on this. This was just a conflict. It's normal. I'm angry and I just need a bit of space." And that's better than sitting, in your bedroom or driving around just avoiding the situation, right?
Mhm.
And so what I'm saying is when you really get to a place where you're no longer kind of a victim of your circumstances and understand that it's like, "Hey, how is this serving me? The way I'm acting, it's serving me some way." And you create awareness to say, "How am I adding to the situation?" Right? What can I do in this moment that would align with that man I want to be? And in order to do
Mhm.
that, you have to tap into your courage. It takes courage to be a leader. It takes courage to lead the marriage when your wife is no longer willing to be part of it with you,
Mm.
right?
Mhm.
I remember like 3 years ago when we were separated, it took courage to come back to my wife and say, "I'm gonna fight for this no matter what, even if you decide to leave. I'm not gonna stop. It's no longer conditional. If I fight for this for 6 months, a year, and then eventually you decide to leave, I'm gonna be okay with that." Because the last thing I wanted my wife to do in that moment, and I'll kinda think about this, but I didn't want her to stay because somehow I convinced her or manipulated her to stay.
Mhm.
One of the best things about my wife, I say this all the time, is she could literally be with anybody else, and she actively chooses to be with me.
Yeah.
Right? I haven't still figured out why, but, here she is.
Yeah, and I love that piece around leadership, right? Because it requires something different, right? Again, like even speaking for myself, like, you know, I probably kind of look for the easiest path, or, like, oh, I just don't want to deal with this right now. And you speak to something so pure in that, like, yeah, like if you want to create something, like, it's going to require leadership. It's going to require you to show up in a different way. And so I really appreciate you speaking to that. um and one of the things that I come across often is, while in conversation, is supporting, generally for me, it's one, I'm not doing relationship coaching, but like, so I'm usually supporting like the man, in the relationship. And one of the things that I come across quite often is that, like, how does a man continue to, support the relationship when he feels like he's the only one doing the work? How does he sort of like stay in the game, so to speak, when he's not seeing results that he's hoping for?
Yeah, I think that really comes down to, again, that idea of choice. One of the things that I tell men when they're in this situation in the beginning is like, right now, before we start entering into this coaching agreement, you need to make a choice. Are you going to work on your marriage for you? Are you going to work on your marriage because you want to be a man that fought for his love, that fought for his marriage? Or are you just working on your marriage because you think if you get all this stuff done, eventually your wife will show up and be madly in love with you again? Because one of them is based in manipulation and fear, and one of them is based in abundance and love. And I think this is really hard for men, right? I think because a lot of times we are problem solvers. And when you look at your marriage as a problem to be solved or your wife as a goal to be achieved, you've already kind of lost the dynamics of, like, you end up being powerless, right? because everything you're doing becomes conditional on whether or not your wife decides to stay or go. And so as long as that's your metric, you're constantly going to be in this emotional roller coaster of like you're going to do things, your wife's going to feel amazing about it, she's going to think you're great, and then the next day she's going to not want anything to do with you again. And you're going to think like, "Oh, but we had it. I had that moment again and now it's gone. How do I get it back?" And what I always tell men is you really want to come at it from a place of being able to look yourself in the mirror and decide how you want to show up. And I call this, self-validated intimacy, right? This is what I do. The actions that I take in my marriage, they're not because I want Kate to show up or be a certain way. They're so that I can look myself in the eye at the end of the day and say, Eric, you're a good man. You fought for this, right?
Hmm.
You took action because this is the type of man you want to be. This is the legacy you want to leave. And you love on this woman, right? That was happening when we first started kind of re-engaging into our marriage. It was no longer about, I love Kate because I want her somehow to fall back in love with me. It was, I'm going to love this human being no matter what. And I'm not going to lie, Andrew, like in the beginning, I didn't love her as a wife, right? The bridge had to be, I'm just going to love her as the mother of my kids because there was so much anger, frustration, resentment that I had to work through. And Kate too, right? So for us, it really started with appreciating her as the mother of our kids, appreciating her as a woman, appreciating her as a career woman. And then as I started to kind of change my focus and really decide for myself, I want to be a husband who figures out how to love his wife again, we started to move closer together. But as long as my metric was Kate's opinion of the marriage, whether or not she wanted to stay, whether or not she was on board, right? Whenever that happened, well, then I was constantly measuring my output based on that. So on days when Kate wasn't really into it, I wouldn't put any work into it.
Mm,
On days when Kate was like, hey, I want to go on a date, I would go all in. And
right.
what was happening in our marriage and what Kate realized is that, oh, like you're only showing up in this marriage because I'm telling you to show up. You're not actually showing up for yourself. Like you're not here because you want to be married to me. You're here because you're scared of us not being together. Right. And I think there's a different
Yeah.
energy there. And it's hard for men to admit that, to look themselves in the mirror. It was hard for me for a lot of times in my life. I was avoidant because I said, well, I don't want to be divorced, right? My parents were together. So my biggest fear was ending my marriage. I was like, I don't want to end my marriage. So to me, a really garbage marriage where we were resentful and we didn't like each other for a while, that seemed better than divorce. And
Hmm.
eventually I had to realize like, well, what kind of marriage do I want? Like, how do I want to be married to my wife? What kind of husband do I want to be? What do I want to move towards? Right. Which again is heart voice, is courage, instead of what am I trying to prevent, which is the end of my marriage.
It's really interesting because one of the things that I heard in your share there, it kind of speaks to like creating this foundation, this being that it just shows up consistently, like no matter what is thrown at you in the marriage. And you know, that just seems like a very powerful place to come from. Like, it's almost like, yeah, like you're that foundation that like you can't be moved. Like you will continue down that path of creation in a sense. That's one thing that really stood out to me in your share there.
Yeah. And I think, I talk about it in terms of like the solid versus the reflected self, right? So for me right now, I have a very solid self. Like, not only am I confident in who I am and the way that I show up as a man, as a husband, as a father, but also I am open to feedback. I am open to learning and evolving constantly. And
Hmm.
that's me and my solid self. But for a long time, and I'm sure a lot of men, who are listening to this, oftentimes you're in your reflected self, which is who you are and how you view yourself is based on how other people view you. Right. So way back
Hmm.
when, if Kate thought I was a crappy husband, I was a crappy husband. I believe that about myself. If she thought I was a good husband, I thought I was a good husband. And that was everywhere. Same thing at work, right? A lot of us do this in work. When our boss is like, "You're an amazing worker," you're like, "Awesome, I'm an amazing worker." And then when our boss is like, "You screwed up," you're like, "I'm such a crappy worker." And it's like you start to define yourself on everybody's opinion of you, which
Hmm.
is what we call the reflected self. And as long as you continue to chase the reflected self, you're going to constantly look for external validation. You're going to be a people pleaser. You're going to want to make everybody happy because you base who you are as a human being on how they view you. Which again, we've talked a lot about this, Andrew, in terms of like, then you're not being authentic,
Hmm.
right? Because authenticity only comes from the solid self. And in order for Kate to be in a relationship with a man, with a separate human being, she needed me to be solid, right?
Yeah.
I say this all the time, but it's like having a business advisor that all he does is say yes. A lot of guys are like this in marriage. It's like, would you trust a business advisor that every time you came up with an idea, they're just like, yep, yep, yep. And a lot of men show up this way because all I want is for you to love me. Because when you think I'm good, I'm good. When you think I'm
Yeah.
bad, I need to do stuff to get back to good. Right. And we fall into this reflected self trap because of the way we grew up, because of the beliefs we have of ourselves, all this stuff. And once you kind of get rid of all that and you decide for yourself who you want to be, well, then you can step into that solid self and start to make those choices as long as you're open to continued growth, right? Continued evolution.
Yeah, so powerful. Yeah, and I really actually like that distinction between that solid self and the reflective self. I don't think I've heard it spoken in that way before, but it makes a lot of sense. Um, yeah, I'll speak to it, really quick, and then we can start to wind down. But like that's one of the things that I really pulled from David Data's work. Kind of around that solid self is that you know people are going to make comments about you. People are going to, your wife knows you best. Like she's going to say the things that like she can get at you. She knows how to in those moments. And oftentimes that's where I see a lot of men falter, right? They kind of go into that reflective self state. And one of the places that I've really, noticed is that like when you have that solid self, those things can kind of reflect off of you. It's not that they don't matter, but like you can be confident in the core of who you are that like they don't have as much impact, and then you can either address the issue or it almost like it creates a sense of light. You can bring lightness to a place that is traditionally a dark place, for
Absolutely.
most men.
And I think too, coming back to this idea of like the first, second, and third stage man, what often happens is if we are not in the solid self, well, being in the reflected self is exhausting, right?
Yeah.
Because you're constantly in this people pleaser mode. You constantly are hyper aware, right? So you're walking on eggshells because you're hyper aware what everybody's thinking of you, their perception of you. So what happens is when you're emotionally fused and you have these codependent relationships, well, it's exhausting. So what happens typically is you go out, you try to get all this reflected self, and then when you get exhausted, you shut everybody out.
Hmm.
And you're like, it's too much to be around you. So you end up avoiding, you're withholding, you're kind of just stuck in your basement at home, trying not to live life. And you fall back into what's called, this first stage, which is just totally autonomous and avoidant.
Hmm.
And in order to really be open and grow, you need to be able to take feedback, right?
Yeah.
It was important to me way back when my wife was saying, "You're disgusting. Like looking at you disgusts me." And I was like, "Okay, as much as this hurts, there's some feedback here." Right? I need to kind of take that in. And sometimes it's hard for men. And if you're not able to be solid, what you're going to do is you're going to avoid feedback. This is how we end up in marriages that are just roommates
Yeah.
because we're not willing to engage in the conversation that's challenging because we think that, oh, if our wife's mad, it's going to mean something about us. So I'm actually just going to avoid altogether and we'll just continue. And people live their whole lives like that.
Yeah.
And that's something that Kate and I are really, vocal about is you have to be real. You have to be you in order to allow your partner to then experience you. That's deep intimacy. But too
Mm.
many of us avoid that because it's scary. It takes courage.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to come to this question that Joe put in, and then yeah, we'll start to wind down. So I'm going to see if what do I need to pull out of here? So, well, I'll just read it. So Joe says, Eric, I'm glad that worked for you. We'll see what that worked for you was. I feel like if I said that to my former spouse or even the current person I'm seeing, that it would come across as very condescending. Okay, I think I remember. So have you had a conversation with your wife about situations just like this so she could receive that type of comment? So if I'm sure you kind of picked it out as well. I could sort of pinpoint this on the conversation where, say Kate's frustrated or angry, and like you pointed that specifically out. Like that's where I get the sense that's where that condescending feel comes from. So yeah, take that one away. See what you got with that one.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. And I think, we're talking about the solid self, but I think oftentimes when I approach Kate and I talk about this, and what I do is I try to validate her emotional experience. So, we call this labeling, right? But the idea here is that, I see Kate's frustrating and I don't make it about me. I don't say like, oh, I think you're frustrated or why are you so frustrated? I don't say these things. I just say, you seem frustrated. And then I let that land and I create space. And oftentimes, Kate will agree and she'll say, I am frustrated. And then she'll expand on that. Or if she's not willing to expand, I say, you willing to tell me more? I'd love to hear more. And I really need to be able to be in my solid self in order to not react to what she's saying. Really hold that space for her. But the beauty of it, Joe, is sometimes I'll say to Kate, my wife, like, you seem frustrated, and she'll correct me. She'll say, I'm
Mm,
not frustrated. I'm annoyed. And I'm not like, then I don't go into like, well, it's the same thing, No. Oh, okay. Tell me more about that. And all I'm doing in the moment is creating a space where my wife can freely express herself. Right? Because what often happens, especially with our wives, is, I don't want to go too deep into this near the end of the call, but our wives, there's so many shame triggers around being a woman, being a wife, being a mother. They're constantly judging themselves. And this is the feminine, right? The feminine is all about kind of the fear, trying to keep everything safe. And so in those moments, I really need to be able to hold space for my wife. And sometimes I'm like, hey, you seem frustrated. She's like, I'm not frustrated. Why are you saying that? And I'm like, oh, I wanted to connect with you. And that's it. And I don't have to say more. And in the moment, if she's angry, this is what will happen sometimes too, Joe, is just like you're saying, there's sometimes when Kate, she'll respond to me in a really intense way. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm here to support you. And I walk away. And what happens is a couple hours later, she comes back to me and she says, hey, I saw what you're trying to do. I'm sorry I did that. And it's like, okay. In that moment, I can't be righteous and be like, yeah, you shouldn't have done that. Like, I was just trying to help, which a lot of men do, right? I'm not bad. You're bad. But what I'm saying is like, okay, hey, all good. I'm here for you. Totally cool that you're frustrated. You're experiencing that stuff if that's what you're experiencing. But all you're doing is it's a bid for connection, right? I'm just opening the gate to your emotional experience. And I don't just do this in the negative. This is the practice too, Joe, which might help you, is that I don't just do it in the negative. I also do it in the positive. Hey, you seem really excited about that. My wife comes to me, oh, you seem really like joyful. I am. Yeah. This happened today and this happened. And so it's less about pinpointing only those quote unquote negative emotions, right? But it is really just about tapping into my wife's emotional experience in order to create connection. Because that's what our wives want. They want to be expressive, they want to open up without us making them feel like their emotions are too much for us, which is often the pitfall that men get into because it's hard for us to hold space, to sit in that fire with somebody in a really close relationship to us having an emotional experience.
mm.
I hope that answers your question, Joe.
That's a absolutely. Um, yeah. So as we kind of get to the end of this, I'd love to hear what's in the future for you, Eric. Where are you guys going with this business, and what are you guys looking to create?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So, Kate and I, we have our podcast, the Evolve Marriage Podcast. It's a great free resource where we interview other couples, other experts, but also share our own experience. It's fun, it's playful, but also there's a lot of great insight there. I specifically work with men, so I'm a men's coach. I help men who feel more like roommates than lovers with their wives, and I bring them through a 12-week program so they can really lead their wife in life and in love, right, in and out of the bedroom, which is important. So that's called the Evolve Men's Collective, which is something that I work on. I don't talk a lot about. So I always send men to our podcast. Check us out on our podcast, our website, evolvemarriage.com. You can check us out there. And we're also active on Instagram at evolved_marriage, where I often give insight. And that's what I'm putting out, man. 2022 is a great year. Like I said, we're planning on traveling this summer and having all kinds of adventures with our two young kids. Kate is a master planner. I'm a master executor. So it's kind of a good relationship in that way.
That's awesome. And I'll make sure to put those links in the comments. And coming back to this piece, because I am very interested in it, like, in the discussion of evolved marriage, like, where do you guys see the next step of your marriage evolving to?
Oh man, yeah, that's great. So currently, Kate and I are really into sexual intimacy, and especially practicing it outside of the bedroom. So
Mm,
we are constantly thinking about how can we create more sexual playfulness, sexual energy, that polarity within us. Kate and I are really into masculine, feminine dynamics and energies. So we're constantly trying to bring in more playfulness into our lives. Kate and I are very hard achievers. Kate is a teacher. She has a business. I have my business. And I think it's very easy for us to fall into that achieving mode all the time. So our relationship and our marriage serves as a place, kind of a sanctum where we can be playful with each other and not take life so seriously. So, Kate and I are open and honest about it. Oftentimes, we're having sex. There's a lot of laughter. There's a lot of playfulness. There's a lot of body parts. um, and so, I think that's kind of our realm right now that we've really been kind of growing and experimenting in. Alongside the emotional aspect, holding space for each other, which I'm sure we're going to face a lot of those challenges in our future with two young kids and growing businesses and traveling for 2 months, living in an RV. I'm sure we'll be at each other's necks in no time.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and I really, it's so cool just to hear like the spaciousness, like the light, the fun that you guys are bringing into your marriage, because it's so easy to, and speaking for myself, right? It's so easy to fall into that realm of achievement and like, hey, we just got to make the money to create the life we want. And then it's like, wait a second, you've totally skipped over like the real gold that's here, right? Creating all of that now. So I love that you guys are looking like you guys are creating more and more from that place. So
Yeah,
yeah,
man.
thanks for speaking to it.
Totally. And I want to say this, right? Just kind of ending it. But the reality is, and this is kind of where we get stuck is intimacy and sexuality. It's inefficient, right? Having an intimate connection with your partner, it's not efficient. And so, as long as we are in this mode to achieve, as long as we're trying to master this idea where we can get from A to B to C when it comes to our closest intimate relationships, we're always going to be missing a part, which is the feeling state,
Hmm.
right? What does it feel like to be connected, to experience pleasure? And a lot of these things are so nuanced that it's hard to even express in words, which is why we need the physicality of it, right? And so I say this all the time, as long as you're trying to be efficient and trying to organize everything and schedule everything, you're always going to be missing a part, which is again for us why we tap into that playfulness, because having a great intimate life, having a great sex life, having emotional intimacy, holding space for your partner, it's not efficient,
Mm,
right? And so you need to be able to play with that dichotomy.
yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks for bringing it all today. And I really appreciate you, taking the time and, a lot of just amazing places that we got to explore in the conversation today.
Thanks, man.
Um, yeah. And for anybody who listened to it this today, or it's going to be on replay, feel free to connect with Eric. I know you didn't mention it on in sort of that aspect of it, but like, is there a place that people could just like connect with you directly? Like, what if that's what you want, is there that place that people can do that?
Yeah, so I'm most active on Instagram right now. All our links are in the bio of our Instagram profile. So if you just follow us at evolved_marriage, you'll get daily news there. That's where we talk about all our podcasts, our courses that we offer. So the best place to connect with me directly, shoot me a DM on Instagram. Say, hey, I'd love to hear from you. If anything landed with you on this conversation, I'm always open to supporting and helping men to really create, a total new evolution of marriage so that your best years are ahead of you. You know what I mean?
Cool. Awesome, man. Well, thanks so much for sharing. All right,
Dude, it's
so
been a pleasure.
we'll wrap up here. Have a great day, everybody, and thanks for tuning in.